Welcome to our In Focus discussion on Native American boarding schools. For more than 150 years, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children, including right here in Utah, were taken from their communities to distant facilities, forced to culturally assimilate and suppress their cultural identities, language, and beliefs. Tonight's conversation will be difficult, but necessary to shed light on the intergenerational traumas that these students and their families endured, the long-lasting impact, and what's being done now to hopefully help the victims heal. Joining us tonight are Danae Dean, Director of MMI Who is Missing, and Angelo Baca, Cultural Resources Coordinator at Utah Danae Johnson. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. Angelo, I would like to start with you. Could you provide some background on the history of residential boarding schools?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here tonight with this very difficult discussion. But very important one. And yes, we have had a significant impact on our Indigenous communities by boarding schools. And the majority of it has not been good. I think the historical trauma has been echoing through the generations, and just realizing the recovery that it takes our injured generations of Native youth to come back to their full selves and understand, realize their cultural history, language, identity, their own ways of life that they've had since their ancestors have, carried on those ways on through the generations. This systemic oppression and abuse of Indigenous children has also been a part of our mission as Utah Danae Johnson, an Indigenous-led conservation organization, nonprofit, as part of healing the earth and our people. So we really think that this is broadly construed and means an incredible amount for Indigenous communities to feel that they have the right, that they have the power, and that they have the strength to be resilient and to be coming back to their full selves. And we really believe that a lot of this work about talking about it, even though it's difficult, is extremely necessary.
Thank you for that. Danae, would you like to add anything to what Angelo said as far as the history and background of residential boarding schools?
Yeah, I do a lot of work with missing and murdered Indigenous people, and this is one of those histories that really takes up a lot of space when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous people. What we're finding out now with the boarding school epidemic is we're finding these mass graves of Indigenous children that were taken away from their families and never returned. These deaths were never documented. They were very much intentional in order to enact genocide on Indigenous people everywhere. So this recent news of the boarding schools and the uncovering of children came out of so-called British Columbia and the Secwepemc tribe. Their children were taken to the Kamloops residential school, and this kind of kickstarted, this mourning within Indigenous communities in recent times, and it's been very, very traumatizing.
Thank you for sharing that. Angelo, I know that everyone on the board of Utah Danae Johnson was a student at one of these residential boarding schools, and you know people perhaps in your family as well who had to attend these schools. Could you share a little bit about some of the experiences that you've heard, just to provide why their experiences were so traumatic?
Yes, I think that's one of the main reasons why we're not completely prepared to talk about it, is that these are difficult experiences that our elders have gone through, and they don't want to have that same experience replicated for their children. But especially in the area of southeastern Utah, there's a constellation of different things that happen historically that really lend towards that boarding school discriminatory racist experience. And one of those would be the fact that settler colonial imposition into our indigenous territories happened pretty early on, just right around the 150-year mark or so, which really isn't that long. If you think about it, it's only 2 or 3 generations. And you could listen to elders tell the stories of the United States military, of LDS settlers coming in, pushing folks around, arresting them, implementing genocide, warfare, starvation, incarceration, removal, any number of things that really are still carried down through the generations, and people have an apprehension to really share that. But there are other things that have also demonstrated this, like the Termination Act of 1954. Utah's U.S. Senator Arthur Watkins was a primary champion of that. He really tried to push that in a national scene. And around here, we had the what was colloquially known as the Posey War, but really it's just a minor incident that could have been taken care of without the linguistic and cultural differences that escalated the incident into something more. But then that was then utilized to incarcerate Ute folks here in the Blanding and San Juan County area. So right after that was when we had really what amounted to the theft of Bears Ears, because the people were beginning to be removed. And not just the people, but the children were being forced to go to boarding school. So that's the way that this country has approached its indigenous peoples, by trying to target the young people to assimilate and acculturate them into American society, to not make them a threat any longer.
Just touching the tip of the surface here. Angelo and Danae, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Native American boarding schools. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Native American boarding schools. Before the break, we were joined by Danae Dean of MMI Who is Missing and Angelo Baca of Utah Diné Bikéyah. We pick up now right where we left off. Danae, your relatives were taken to Intermountain Board School in Brigham City. What can you tell us about the experiences that they had there?
Well, Utah had 4 boarding schools. The Uinta, Ouray, there was one in Aneth, and the Intermountain Boarding School in Brigham City, which operated between 1950 and 1984. And Angelo was correct when he was saying, bringing up Arthur Watkins, because Arthur Watkins was directly involved in the implementation of the assimilation of this residential boarding school, in which their main purpose was to take Indigenous children, primarily from the Navajo Nation, my relatives, and dislocate them from their land, assimilate them into white culture. They were forced to choose a Christian religion. They were forced to wear their hair in white identifying mainstream culture. The amount of abuse that those children experience there is really shocking. They weren't fed correctly. A lot of the programming within the school was dedicated to having them basically do slave labor and train them to have the skills to go out in the world and have really low income jobs, and to assimilate them and send them to off their homelands. And the main reason for these schools is it all goes back to land, right? So if you take the children from the land, the future generations from that land, then you can go in and do land grabs. You can do, this is all about the land trusts and violating some of the treaties and trying to maneuver around those so that the Indigenous people were taken off the land so that they can then use the land for resources, which is what we see today. And Perhaps one of the most difficult realities that I read about the Intermountain boarding school was their process of hurting the young men. So they would cut their hair when they were doing things wrong. They would handcuff them, and then they would inject them with a tranquilizer. And so these accounts of abuse are not okay. We haven't been able to talk about them as Indigenous people because nobody has been willing to listen. And so what's happening in Canada, they have more than 150 schools there. In the US, we have more than 365 schools. 100 of those schools are still in operation today. And this is something that's not history. This is recent trauma. It's ongoing trauma, and it's something that we desperately need to reconcile with.
Absolutely unspeakable, and we haven't talked about this, but we want to be part of the conversation now, and we need to talk about it. How have these residential boarding schools and assimilation left deep societal scars on our Native American population?
Well, I think that's a really broad and complicated question because it can be everything from as simple as a difficulty trying to get yourself seen as a legitimized member or citizen of American society. A lot of these places where attendees to boarding schools went, it's really difficult to find their records, and as such to say that they are part of a specific tribe or a community, or even to get documents of official nature like passports and state identifications. So those are major inconveniences because, as we've seen recently, even with voting rights, it's difficult for Native Americans to get registered and vote, and that's increasingly been the case. So this effort to do erasure and kind of a conflation of Indigenous communities into an American public is ongoing and hasn't stopped. The work of the boarding schools did tremendous damage, but we're still working very hard to recover our communities, our traditional knowledge, our cultural and medicine ways, and we're really fighting to keep our language alive and moved into all the spaces that youth are now dynamically living their lives in. And we think that's one of the most important investments that we can make, is that young people are invested into their own culture and language and their communities and have a certain sense of pride in that. Because as we've seen, it's very difficult for those young people who don't have support and feel vulnerable in these difficult times, especially now, and want to know who they are, where they come from, what gives them emotional, spiritual, mental strength. And that's knowing who you are, where you come from, and where you're going.
Well said. Angela and Danae, hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Native American boarding schools. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on Native American boarding schools. We resume our conversation now with Danae Dean of MMI Who is Missing and Angelo Baca of Utah Dene Bakea. Angelo, can you talk about the letter that your organization sent to Secretary Deb Haaland? What did you offer to her investigation, and what do you hope comes out of it?
Well, I think that the offer to Secretary Haaland is more of one of assistance, collaboration, and support, because we believe that this endeavor is extremely needed right now. Obviously, with all of the stories that have happened recently with the mass graves at the boarding schools that we've seen in Canada and in other places, it's always been at the forefront of our minds because we've had so many questions about the lost generations of children from our communities that were never answered. So we want to be part of that problem solving and understand what did happen to them, where did they go, and where can we find them, and how can we bring them home. And I think that it's important for not just our organization and the elders who are a part of it, but it's really important for the future of our Native communities to know that we do think about them. We still carry them in our hearts and in our prayers. And it's just a beacon of hope to see that Secretary Deb Haaland also feels very strongly and passionately about this and wants to take up that initiative and push forward, looking for answers and hopefully find some form of healing for our communities.
Thank you for that. Danae, what do you hope comes out of this investigation that Secretary Haaland launched?
This is a complicated question for me. What I know that came out of so-called Canada is the Truth and Reconciliation Report, where the Indigenous nations made more than 95 suggestions on how the Canadian government can reconcile its past history and current history on Indigenous people. But what we're seeing is that's not changing. I don't expect the U.S. to have that same kind of process. We do have advocates and Indigenous people to represent our histories, like Secretary Deb Haaland, but it's going to take so much more than that. It's going to take individuals really learning these things that they're not forced to learn. Those who are non-Indigenous have full freedom and the privilege to not learn about all this stuff. And it's not taught in our history schools. Like when I was going to school, the first time I learned about the word genocide was the Holocaust. What about my genocide as an Indigenous person? These atrocities that have been committed on Indigenous children, on babies, on Indigenous children that have been thousands. There are thousands of them. Those children were supposed to be our grandparents now. Those children were supposed to produce families and kinship systems and clan systems, and those are all gone. And we see those effects today. We see them with domestic violence. We see patriarchy, within our Indigenous communities. We see a lot of suffering with self-identity. Our youth are often confused about who they are because they've been assimilated. We see a lot of sexual violence. There was so much sexual violence that took place in these boarding schools, so much rape of Indigenous children. And when those children were raped, they were also impregnated by these priests, even by Mormon officials. And guess what happened to those children? We don't know. Those children were killed, and I have been reading the stories, the first-hand accounts of these Indigenous survivors. They speak of horrific things, unimaginable things, like throwing infants, newborn infants, into the fire to get rid of them, burying them in the walls, starving children. No children should go to school and end up dying at that school. No school should have a mass grave, and we're seeing that everywhere. The U.S. really has to prepare for the truth that's going to be coming out because they have so much blood on their hands.
This is difficult to hear, but it's history that's been erased. And in order for us to even start this healing process, we have to acknowledge the tragedies that have happened in the past.
Absolutely, Rosie. Thank you so much for having us today.
Yeah. Before we leave you, I'd like to give you both the opportunity to tell us a little bit about your organizations. We have about 2 minutes left. Angelo, can we start with you? Where can people find more information, and maybe tell us a little bit more about what Utah Denebekeya does?
Sure. Denebekeya is a Indigenous-led conservation nonprofit organization, and we're grassroots. We're really formed out of San Juan County, and we basically have a lot of strength intertribally to protect sacred lands that we are really in service towards protecting, such as Bears Ears National Monument. And we really do believe in our mission statement about healing the earth and the people. And we really think part of that is protecting sacred sites so that we have these places to address historical trauma. We have places to address healing, because healing is hard work and it's sometimes not comfortable or easy. And that is something that this country still has to do. So we should start now, just like we should have started the moment that folks got here. And we have to make it through thinking about the future and not just going back to the past, but also just, remembering our ancestors, our elders, and future generations. And I think that's what we're seeing as, the larger picture here. We want to have everyone included in that vision of healing.
Thank you so much. Danae, about 30 seconds left. Can you tell us a little bit about MMI Who is Missing?
Yeah, I'm the one who runs MMI Who is Missing, and it's a campaign to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and the unique struggles that we face as nations. So many of our relatives go missing. I started this work because in honor of my auntie Priscilla, who was murdered. And every Indigenous person today is a survivor of genocide. Every Indigenous person today has a relative who is actively missing or is murdered. That's how deep this trauma runs. That's how deep these boarding schools have left a legacy that we have to clean up by ourselves. And that's what this campaign is about, and we are dedicated to mutual aid. We are dedicated to listening to survivors and victims, and Indigenous people are the greatest protectors of the land, air, and water, just like Angela said. And that's what this is all about. It's us being taken away from the land, and therefore the consequences, not just for Indigenous people, but for the entirety of the world. We're seeing it today. We're seeing it with the floods. We're seeing it with the forest fires. We're seeing it with climate change. It's here. It's here because we took Indigenous people who have existed from time immemorial, caring for the land, being a good relative with the land and with all relations. And this is the result. This is the result, is the world that we live in right now.
You've been hearing from Danae Dean, Director of MMI Who is Missing, and Angela Baca, Cultural Resources Coordinator at Utah Diné-Bikéyah. Thank you both so much for your time and participation tonight on this difficult topic. We appreciate the both of you, and I gotta toss us to break, so we will be right back.
Thank you, Rosie.